This is Isha Das. I am the spiritual director of the Assisi Institute. And I'm very happy today to be having a conversation with my dear friend and colleague, Roger Palma. And we're going to be talking about a very relevant issue. That is the coronavirus, but looking at the coronavirus as an opportunity for really all of humankind to evolve to a whole different level together. So let me introduce my friend Roger. Again, Roger is a dear friend and colleague. He is a graduate of the University of Notre Dame and also holds a law degree. And he is, in addition to being a very good human being, a very knowledgeable person with, I think, keen insights on the human condition. Roger, it's good to be talking with you again today.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure, Isha Das. And for the benefit of those who might be new to Assisi Institute Productions, let me give a brief introduction to you as well. You are an accomplished teacher, writer, lecturer, practicing psychotherapist, and you are the spiritual director of the Assisi Institute. You are a busy man. Previously, you had been a pastoral administrator at the Church of Saints Peter and Paul in Rochester, and you have earned graduate degrees in religious studies, also from the University of Notre Dame, and clinical psychology from the University of Duquesne. Your education includes extensive study in psychology, spirituality, mysticism, world religions, and yoga, and I'm probably leaving a few things out. You proudly count the brilliant writer Richard Rohr among your lifelong friends and mentors. You were made a minister and official Kriya Yoga teacher by Roy Eugene Davis, a direct disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda. The latest book by Isha Das is Open Wider the Door, the Integration of Kriya Yoga in Mystical Christianity. Your resume is too long. I'm tired. I'm going to need to rest.
You're a sweet man, Roger.
And you were a very good friend. I'm going to start with a segue from our prior podcast. When we touched upon the process of initiation specific to boys growing into the role of manhood, as it is experienced primarily in some indigenous cultures. At one of our last Kriya Yoga services before our social distancing shutdown, you spoke of the relevance of a different kind of initiation to our societal crisis with COVID-19. The initiation process as it applies to young men in indigenous cultures forces them outside of their daily routines or comfort zones, if you will. And as such, they must confront the physical and psychological challenges of the wilderness. Do you see this initiation process being applicable to what we are now experiencing as a society?
Absolutely. Let me talk about initiation in a general way, and then I'll talk about it specifically in the context of the coronavirus. That initiation isn't just an external ritual. Initiation opens us up to different and new levels of consciousness, new and different levels of seeing the world and seeing reality. And once those new levels of awareness are open, then we can function in a very different way in the world. So let me bring that to the coronavirus. Clearly, the coronavirus is interrupting our lives. It's creating a new normal that hasn't quite arrived yet. And what I like to say to people is that in every crisis is an opportunity. So in this pandemic crisis, there's an opportunity for not just young men, but humankind in general to be initiated into a whole new way of seeing each other, seeing the world, seeing ourselves, seeing the environment. And I don't want to romanticize this pandemic, but it is offering us a new path forward if we avail ourselves to it.
Well, you just mentioned the new normal, and that's going to prompt, I think, an obvious follow-up question, because you've recently devoted an entire week in your daily reflections called Living Grace, which, by the way, you make available by email to any and all who are interested. But you had concentrated on that topic that you have called the new normal. Now, over the course of the week, that was a very rich discussion, and it could easily fill several podcasts by itself. But I'm going to just pick out one phrase that truly resonated with me. And you wrote, "If our tired ideologies could have saved us, they would have done so. Something fresh is needed, springs of living water to revitalize our dulled hearts and stagnant minds." To put it succinctly, what exactly do you mean by this process of revitalization?
Well, I have been saying to people for years, and don't misunderstand me, I did not predict this pandemic in any way, but I've been saying to people for years that something had to give. Our culture, our Western civilization in many ways has become divisive, dysfunctional, and even destructive, so that something had to give. Let me paraphrase a quote that is attributed to Albert Einstein. He said, "The consciousness that created the problem is never the consciousness that can fix or solve the problem." Clearly, in the old normal, something wasn't working. We were so divisive. Our treatment of the environment was destructive. Materialism, consumerism was just running rampant. We could not keep that up. So the new norm is clearly not a return to the ideology or the old way of seeing ourselves and each other. There has to be a new way of seeing ourselves and each other so that we can interact with each other, with the environment from a completely different place.
Very good, very good, yes. Well, let's take a look at this from a slightly different vantage point. This enforced confinement has presented us with many challenges. One of them is a loss of characteristics or activities that cumulatively form what we like to think of as our identity. Someone may identify him or herself as a teacher, or as an athlete, or as a member of a musical group, or as a bartender, or as a passionate sports fan. In the aggregate, we are many of these attributes, and now we're none. I'm going to ask you to comment on this crisis of identity, and perhaps, if you will, frame it against the backdrop of 2 points made by the Franciscan priest Richard Rohr, whom you describe as a personal mentor, in the context of his own discussion of initiation. He has written 2 challenging phrases. "My life is not about me, and I'm not in control." These are powerful statements, particularly in a time of isolation and the loss of the trappings of identity. Could you share some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, before I get specifically to Richard's thoughts or comments, let me talk about this loss of identity in the context of what the great late mythologist Joseph Campbell talked about as the hero's journey. And it's really it's an archetypal pattern that cuts across all cultures and is a big part of this initiation process. And so typically when somebody is called to live life heroically, to live life in a fully conscious way, they're always taken out of the norm. They're always taken out of the mundane way that they have constructed the world. And they actually go through a period of deconstruction, not to result in psychological madness, but then the emergence of a truer, more authentic self and a truer and more authentic way of seeing the world. But it's not always an easy process. So many of us are losing or have lost our identities in the sense of we're locked in our houses, we're not doing the same work we were doing in the same way. All of those ways that we've identified ourselves, it's like they're being taken away, which is painful. But if we can stay with the process and look within, we begin to discover that something else emerges, that there's a deeper self that emerges that can engage the world in completely different ways. I'll just give you a little example. And we've all read in the news or seen in the news that so many people are stepping up, neighbors helping neighbors. I have a stepdaughter who's a nurse who is working on a coronavirus ward in an intensive care unit in the hospital. And those are just a little example. So many people, their hearts are opening and people are becoming, I think, generally more compassionate. They're thinking of their neighbors more. My wife and I, we live in a rural section outside of the city of Rochester. And there's a few houses on our street. And it was so sweet. It was a couple of weeks ago, we were walking and one of the neighbors she was in her front yard and we were 6 feet away from her. But she just asked us, or if there's anything that we can do for you, don't hesitate to ask. So I see more and more of that happening. So that's what I'm saying, that when we're taken out of our mundane world, the way we've constructed the world, yes, there's a deconstruction that happens, but that deconstruction is paving the way for a new and more constructive and positive way of engaging the world. So I think we're all sort of being forced into this hero's journey in some way, shape, or form. And now I want to tie this to Richard's 2 quotes, that our lives are not about ourselves and we're not in control. I think that's part of what emerges in terms of this new consciousness, that first of all, I think we were living prior to the pandemic, we were living under the illusion, because we have advanced in so many ways, scientifically, medically, our technologies, we are so advanced that I think we were operating under this illusion that we were in control of the forces of nature. And that creates a kind of almost like a narcissism and a false sense of security. And I think one of the things that this pandemic is teaching us is we're not really in control of nearly as much as we think we are. That we all have a level of vulnerability. And now that could break us and create a kind of nihilism and hopelessness, or it can open us up to the possibility that, yes, I may not, as an individual, be in control of the forces of nature, but there is an organizational intelligence working within the evolutionary process that is in control. So it's not so much being out of control when we recognize that we're not in control. It's just giving ourselves over to something bigger than ourselves. You could call it nature, you could call it the universe, this evolutionary impulse, and of course you can call it God. So yes, we're not in control of much, but we're part and parcel of something large and good and benevolent that is taking us somewhere. So there's a paradox. We're not in control, but we don't have to be out of control because we're resting in something much bigger and grander than ourselves. His other comment about our lives not being about ourselves, it kind of flows from that. Again, I think prior to this terrible ordeal that we're going through, we were all kind of focusing on what I call our happiness projects, trying to create our meaning, trying to create our happiness. And again, the crisis associated with this pandemic has pulled us out of that kind of narrow narcissistic focus that my life is really not about me. It's about something much larger than me. And as we open up to that, that's when our life really takes on a great deal of meaning. Let me just say it this way, that the goal of life is not happiness. To make happiness the goal of life, the metaphor that I use are two metaphors. It's sort of like nailing Jell-O to a tree. It doesn't quite work. The other metaphor I like to use, it's like a dog chasing its tail. It never quite catches it. That's when we make happiness the goal, because it's effusive. You can't really grab onto it for long, because conditions change all the time. But when we make meaning the goal, or a purposeful life, a meaningful life, a life that is making a difference in the world, that becomes increasingly attainable when we live for something bigger than ourselves, something true, something beautiful, something good. Our lives, without trying, become full, and we know a kind of joy that is far deeper and richer and bigger than happiness. So again, I think that is one of the levels of initiation that is happening, that we're being open up to the fact that the pursuit of happiness has limitations, but the pursuit of a noble, meaningful life, a selfless life, has no limitations.
Wow, yes. Thank you. In the course of that answer, you mentioned a paradox, and I think that kind of leads naturally into the next question I'd like to ask, which is also an outgrowth of Richard Rohr's writings about the process of initiation. There was a third characteristic that I think deserves standalone status. It is, as you like to say, taking it a little deeper. He has written that along with my life is not about me and I'm not in control, that I'm going to die. I think we have all been feeling our mortality a little more proximate during this crisis. Now, I've heard you speak of death as a paradox. Can you describe what you mean by that?
Sure. Again, let me go back to something I said earlier, that because of all of our scientific advancements, and people are living longer, they're, generally speaking, certainly here in the West, they're living healthier lives. We have, I think, fallen into this trap of denying our mortality. Now, I'm not talking about a morbid fascination with death. There's just something about coming to terms with the fact that we are mortal, that our life projects sooner or later are going to come to an end. There's something about coming to terms with that in this paradoxical way makes life richer and deeper. So let me just give a concrete example. I have a wonderful wife. Her name is Vicky Jo. And we're both getting on in years. We're both in our mid-60s. I'm just keenly aware of the fact that there's an end in sight in terms of our relationship in this lifetime, in this dimension right here. And yeah, it could make me sad, but at the same time, it doesn't make me sad. It makes me value every moment that we have together more. It makes me celebrate the moments that we just think are insignificant, sharing a meal, laughing together. All of that takes on a new preciousness and a depth when we realize that there is an end in sight. There's a line by Jesus, I think it's in John's Gospel, where he says, those who seek to gain their lives will lose it, and those who seek to lose their lives will gain it. And I think what he was getting at, and all of the mystical and contemplative traditions teach this in some way, shape, or form, that you have to die before you die. And if you die before you die, this is the paradox, you become much more alive, and your life becomes richer. I've had the privilege of walking a few people to their death, people of faith, people who knew they were dying, and they always tell me that they are more alive as they approach their death in an emotional, psychological, and spiritual way than they were when they were young and healthy. So again, there's something about accepting the mortality that makes us more present to the possibilities, more present to the people we love, more present to the opportunities that are in front of us. We take nothing for granted.
Yes. Let me just echo that. I don't think there's any question that anyone who has had to confront mortality in a very proximate way can experiences an awakening of sorts, an enrichment of the moment, of each moment. Your words resonate very, very strongly and clearly with me. There's one characteristic that seems to flow naturally from these considerations of death and mortality, and that's fear. Now, we often stigmatize it as a four-letter word, and while it can immobilize us, we should also recognize that even Jesus had to confront his fears, knowing the horrendous and painful ordeal he was about to undertake. Can you share some of your thoughts about fear in both a very real and very spiritual sense as they relate to our current situation?
Sure. Let me just start with just on a psychological level. It's hard to go through what we're all going through without having moments of anxiety and fear. And we ought to not shame ourselves around that fear. We shouldn't shame ourselves for having anxiety. We have to acknowledge our fears. We have to face them. But we don't have to be overshadowed by the fear and the anxiety. That's the difference. Again, we don't have to be overshadowed by the fear and the anxiety. We can accept and own the fear, face it, but then look through it to something bigger and larger than the fear. So let me just put it in this context. Again, part of the whole theme with this, that we're talking about today is that the coronavirus, this pandemic, is an opportunity to be initiated into a whole new level of life. And that doesn't mean just a simple psychological shift or a simple, switch in our frame of reference, a change in our frame of reference. I think it's opening us up to a dimension that all of the world mystics describe in various ways, that there is a level of reality, a level of consciousness that is larger than the material world, larger than what the five senses can measure, and even larger than what the logical linear brain can figure out. Richard Rohr, my mentor, will often refer to it as liminal space, and that comes from the Latin word threshold, that there is this threshold of new consciousness. Yogananda might have talked about it as Christ consciousness. The New Testament, for example, might talk about the life of the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, that there is this level of consciousness that opens up to us as we go through this hero's journey. And we can exist within this liminal space, this Christ consciousness, and then deal with our fears from that perspective, that we're part of something large. We're part of something good. We're part of something that is dynamic and active. And that, again, gives us some solid ground, a resting place from which to view our fears. And let me just bring that back to death. We're all part of this something large. And even when the body drops away through death, we don't drop away. Because, again, there's something in us that is larger than the material creation, that is part and parcel of this larger consciousness, part of the divine life. So once we begin to nurture that consciousness through prayer, contemplative prayer, through meditation, and selfless service, it's like we really become larger than our fears. We still have them, and we still have our anxieties, but we become larger than they are, which empowers us to manage them, to see through them, and to continue to be a constructive and positive force in the world. But again, we have to make the effort to nurture this liminal consciousness. I'll say it this way. It's sort of like having one foot in heaven and one foot on the earth simultaneously. That is how we're meant to live and exist. And that actually allows us to navigate through the world and its challenges with great wisdom and with great love.
Beautiful, beautiful. Now, throughout the course of this discussion today, I think we've been talking about what is it, at its essence, a transformational process that we're going through as individuals and as a society. Now, on that particular theme, there are probably very few, if any, gurus, mystics, or saints closer to your heart than Francis of Assisi, whose whole life was a process of transformation. Can you extract some relevant themes or messages from his life that might even provide a ray of hope or even inspiration as we confront the challenges of the moment?
Sure. If anybody knows anything about Francis of Assisi, the 13th century Catholic saint and the founder of the Franciscan order, you know that he's bigger than life, and the stories about him are bigger than life. So there's a tendency, I think, when we read about somebody like Francis or hear about them, we can say, well, that's Francis. I'm not that. I'm not this bigger than life personality. And Francis had a simple comeback to that I think is universally relevant and timeless. He said that if God can work through me, he can work through anyone. And that wasn't false humility. Francis didn't start out as an enlightened saint. First half of his life was spent, as he would say, chasing after false gods and so forth. And then he had a breakdown of sorts and spent time in a prison. He was taken as a prisoner of war. But out of that, again, it's the same pattern that we're seeing today. Out of that darkness, out of that loss of who he thought he was, emerged this life that he surrendered to, this life within him that brought him to a new level. And that life is really in all of us, period. I like to say, God has no stepchildren. We're all God's favorites. That spark of life that was in Francis, Yogananda, and even in Jesus is in all of us. What Francis was able to do was allow that spark, or maybe a better metaphor is that divine seed, to sprout forth in his life. And he gives us a very simple formula. He said, start by doing what you must do. What's in front of you? What are the duties in front of you? What are the obligations that your life brings to you? Being a good husband, a good wife, a good parent, a good worker. Start there, but not not do it in a unconscious way. Bring your best self, bring your best love, bring your best intelligence to whatever you're doing, no matter how simple or mundane that task is. And then it becomes a transformative task. Then he said, you will find yourself doing what is possible. You get stretched and you find that you're doing more. And then you do that with that same kind of love and attention. And he said, soon you will find yourself doing the impossible. So the more that we just bring that love and that attention, as Francis did, to everything, the possibilities really unfold. The goal, though, is not to do something that is going to make headlines or get us on the news. Wherever we are, we're called to blossom, to bloom where we are planted, to bring that life, that divine seed, that light that is within us forward. Let me just say it this way, which is true of Francis's life. If we want to be truly, truly effective and powerful in the world, if we want to make a difference in our own lives and the lives of other people, the only way to really do that in a life-giving way is by becoming more and more loving. Love is literally the most powerful force in all of creation, because love is literally the Spirit of God, the breath of God, the energy of God, working within time and space and within creation. So like Francis, the more that we yield to love and bring love to bear upon every situation that faces us, we become, I love the word paradox, we become paradoxically more effective and more powerful in the world. Just think of a more recent historical example, Mother Teresa, a simple little poor nun from Albania, not working in her own country, but working in India, really left a profound imprint on thousands upon thousands of people she interacted with, but left a positive imprint for the whole world. That's why I say, if we want to be influential and powerful in the world, the only way to really do it that is life-giving is by surrendering more and more to love.
Wow, yes, yes. Okay. Tough to get grounded after that one. We've touched upon death, fear, loss of identity, a number of other upbeat themes, which paradoxically, you have made upbeat. But perhaps we can close with a question that starts from a more hopeful premise. I'd like to read one more quote, and this is from the Trappist monk, mystic, and brilliant writer Thomas Merton. And you had included this in one of your daily Living Grace reflections. Merton wrote, "You do not need to know precisely what is happening or exactly where it is all going. What you need is to recognize the possibilities and the challenges offered by the present moment and to embrace them with courage, faith, and hope." Now, Merton has not been with us for some time, so he did not write that in the midst of this pandemic. But the message certainly resonates in the moment. But when we are surrounded by so much fear and uncertainty, how do we find the wherewithal to face all of these challenges with, as he writes, courage, faith, and hope?
Well, it's a great question to answer, to ask at the end, and I think, a great way of bringing our discussion to a conclusion. Let me again put what Merton said in a specific context. Merton was a man of contemplative prayer. He was a man of deep meditation. He lived in that space that I referred to earlier as liminal space, the sacred space, the space of the spirit. He was grounded in that. And to the degree that we allow ourselves to live from that liminal sacred space, that sacred consciousness, we have an intuitive knowing that, again, that love is the most powerful force in all of creation. And not as a belief, but as an experience. Belief and faith are two different things. Belief is a mental construct. Faith is an experience of something intuitively that we know is true, and it's an dynamic energy. So as we ground ourselves in that spaciousness, in that liminal space, we intuit the movement of the divine within creation and even within dark circumstances, and we intuit that it's all working towards the good. So we can say, and this in some ways is to paraphrase or to summarize what Merton said, that we can get to this place where we realize that nothing really happens to us. It all happens for us. You know, I like to say to people, we see reality. Think of reality in life as a long, big parade. We just see it through this little peephole somewhere in the middle. We don't see what came before it and what's coming after it. We don't see how the parade all fits together. But when we nurture, as Merton did, that liminal space, that sacred space, we have an intuition that somehow it's working all together for our good. Maybe the best place to close is with this quote from Julian of Norwich, who was a mystic, a Christian mystic, I think around the 14th century. And she would actually have visions of Christ coming to her. And she felt so much love coming from God through Christ to her that she found it hard to reconcile that with all the suffering in the world. And so she presented that question to Jesus in one of her visions, and this is what she said that Jesus said back to her. All is well, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well. I'm going to repeat that. All is well, all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. That kind of faith, it's not a mental belief. That kind of faith comes from an intuitive knowing that is born from that liminal space, from that communion with the divine. And I think ultimately that's how we navigate through this crisis that we're in. The very wisdom and love of the divine is available to us if we tap into it.
All right. I'll take a deep breath after that. Simply, from a very personal level, I want to thank you for your illuminating and inspirational words, and not just what you shared with us now, but what you make available to us on an ongoing basis. But I think what's evident to those of us who know you, and I know you well, is that you have, if I can borrow overused sports cliche, taken your game to the next level and expanded your presence and influence during this time of crisis and uncertainty, a time when it is so dearly needed. So on a very personal level, I thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, Roger. And thank you for engaging in this conversation. You always ask the right stimulating questions that allow me to kind of take off. I hope that was helpful for you, and hopefully it was helpful for our listeners. And I value your friendship, and we're going to get through this together. Again, it won't be the old normal, it'll be a new normal. And right now we're going through the birthing pains to that new normal, but we will get through this together. And people like you, Roger, of such goodwill, give me hope for the future. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank
And I
you.
just want to say to anybody that's listening, thank you for tuning in. God bless you. Pray for us, and we will be praying for all of you in the world. Prayers make a difference. Prayers change the chemistry of things. Amen.
Amen.
I think that's a wrap.